Well, thank you, Paul, and welcome. Paul Lee heads the pro bono practice at Steptoe, and in that capacity, he has had an opportunity to supervise attorneys who are working with recent Afghan arrivals and settle them in Northern Virginia. Really went beyond their mandate in helping a number of Afghans who came in with the Afghan Allies program. Paul does have a background in nonprofits where, among other things, he represented unaccompanied minors coming into the United States. And like many of us, has a personal immigration story. His family were refugees or immigrants. So welcome, Paul, and thanks for being with us.
Great, thank you so much, Mary. And thank you to Ashley and the entire Holy Trinity community for welcoming me tonight. It's really a pleasure to speak with you all, particularly because I know your church is doing some really fantastic work in helping families get resettled in the DC area. And we all know that these are families in incredible need who are fleeing kind of unfathomable persecution. And so anything that you can do in this community is helpful, and anything I can do to help you, I will. I will give just a quick little bit more background about myself before we dive into the presentation, just so you know where I'm coming from. So as Mary mentioned, my name is Paul Lee. I'm the pro bono counsel at a law firm called Steptoe and Johnson. We're based in Washington, D.C. If you ever walk through DuPont Circle, we're right next to the Krispy Kreme. You've probably seen our office. So our law firm is a big commercial law firm. We represent lots of large corporations and do lots of big dollar transactions and whatnot. But my job is the best job at the firm. I get to coordinate our pro bono program. And so everybody at the firm participates. All the lawyers get involved and take on cases. I actually learned through I guess there are members of your church who do what I do at other law firms. So I actually connected with my colleagues, Kitty Walk and Barbara Butterworth, who do what I do at their law firms respectively. So you already have some great folks in your firm, in your church, who are working at other firms, which is fantastic. So my background is immigration law. And before I came to Steptoe, and I was at another firm before that, I did work with unaccompanied minors, unaccompanied children in the immigration system. I worked for an organization called Kids in Need of Defense, KIND. And you know, I'm sure you've heard of the stories now of children at the border. We recall the stories of kids, you know, getting torn from their parents' hands and being put into detention centers. That was all under, you know, the last administration in the 2016 era. But this was happening well before that too. I mean, it's sad to say that this is not a new problem. So I was working on that issue for many years, and it was really, I mean, it sounds like an incredibly difficult place to work. You imagine there are a lot of sad stories and really, you know, gut-wrenching tales. But at the same time, I learned so much from these children, and I got a lot of inspiration from them. They are brave, they are resilient. And even at such very young ages, they're able to comprehend so much. So I was really appreciative of my time there. And as Mary mentioned, you know, the story is also personal for me. I am a child of immigrants. My parents lived through the Korean War. My mother was actually born right at the start of the Korean War. And so they were internally displaced refugees. My mother was able to flee just off the coast of Korea for a few years. And then both of my parents made it to the United States eventually. So they didn't go through the refugee system that I'm going to talk about tonight, but they certainly understood the terror of war and the struggle of rebuilding after that. And so this comes from a place that is very close to my heart. So with that out of the way, I'm going to do one more piece of business, just a disclaimer. So I am an attorney, and I have to put in the whole legalese language here. Nothing that I'm telling you today really should count as legal advice. And so please don't, tell someone that my lawyer, Paul Lee, told me this information, because that's not what this is. This is just a general overview of this process, just to give you guys a little bit more background as you do this important work. And so I will leave some time at the end for Q&A. And if you have questions along the way, feel free to drop them in the chat. But I will leave about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. But I ask that you just not ask any questions specific to any clients and not use any client proper names or identifying information in our conversation today. So with that out of the way, I am going to share my screen. We practiced this, so should be okay here. And go through this presentation. Can everyone see that? We'll wait. Excellent. Okay. And just a little roadmap of what I'm going to cover today. It's just a very broad overview. The slides are very basic. This is just to guide us through the conversation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the current situation of where we are right now, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with since you're doing this work. We'll talk about what it means to be a refugee as well as an asylee and what is the difference between those terms. We'll talk a little bit about the immigration system in general. We'll talk about the benefits of doing asylum and refugee work and what it means for your families that you're working with. We'll talk about resources that are available. So I have this short presentation to give you, but I'm sure you'll have questions along the way. So there might be other resources that you can access for your family so that they can get legal help to find immigration relief. And then I'll just leave time at the end, as I mentioned, for Q&A. But please, if you have questions along the way, maybe I could rely on Ashley or Mary just to keep an eye on the chat in case any questions pop in. So, all right, so the global crisis, we know where we are right now. It sounds like most of the families that you guys are working with are from Afghanistan. So we think back to August 15th, 2021. Seems so long ago, but it's really not that far ago, when the Taliban regime took over in Kabul. And that represented basically a shift in the political control of Afghanistan. If you think way back to 2001, right after 9/11, that was when the government had shifted again. And so a more democratic regime had been put in place post 9/11. And so actually in 2001, many families who had fled Afghanistan had started to come back to Afghanistan. They realized that it was a safer place to live and that they were becoming more progressive with their civil rights. They were allowing women to be educated, and there were things that were changing in the government and in the country that made people feel very hopeful about where things were going. But then, as we know, things shifted last year. The US government pulled out with their military support, and a lot changed in Afghanistan. There are 2.6 million refugees worldwide from Afghanistan during this most recent shift. Those refugees are all over. Many of them are in neighboring countries, Pakistan, India, all over the Middle East as well, Turkey. And then we have some that have made it to the United States as well, and we'll talk about that. There are also 4 million internally displaced individuals. And so when we think of refugees, we always think of people who flee their country. But of course, we know that there are many people who are unable to flee, whether it's because of cost or transportation, logistics, or that they can't leave behind their families, or they don't want to leave behind their families. They love their country, and they can't leave. And so there are still many within the country that are facing incredible danger. We know about Ukraine. So just a few months ago, Russia again invaded Ukraine, more of Ukraine, and took over the eastern region and now most of the country, and led to another war that is breaking out as we speak. And there was a huge rush of refugees out of Ukraine, much faster than in Afghanistan and in other war-torn countries. Part of it was kind of just closeness. The borders were kind of closer, and it's a smaller country, and they were able to flee, more access to transportation, more of a Ukrainian diaspora outside in Europe. But there was this big outflow of immigrants, 6.7 million refugees. That's just in the matter of 4 months. That's an incredible number of people leaving one country, primarily throughout Europe. We know that Poland has taken in many, many refugees, Romania, Slovakia, other countries around Ukraine. And then again, just like in Afghanistan, there are about 8 million internally displaced individuals or families who are not living in their homes, but elsewhere in the country. The United States has not really seen a big influx of Ukrainian refugees yet. Part of it is just that it's harder to get to the United States. You have to fly, you have to have a visa to get in. And also a lot of Ukrainians are going to connect with family members, and there's not a huge Ukrainian population in the US. But we will see more refugees coming in from both Ukraine and Afghanistan. I'll also point out that there are refugees from other countries in the world. So Ukraine and Afghanistan are certainly dominating our headlines right now, but refugees have been circulating the world from Syria, Venezuela, South Sudan, Myanmar, every continent, many, many different countries. There are estimates that there are over 90 million refugees in the world right now, and that number has doubled in the past decade. Lots of reasons for this, obviously political instability and war, but also things like economic instability, racial injustice, climate change. Things are pushing people around much more than they were before, and it's just not safe for them to stay where they are. And then we think about refugees as fleeing war, and I think that is the traditional way of thinking about it. But I also want to kind of frame our mindset to think about refugees in a different way. And in particular, in the DC area, we see a huge influx of immigrants from El Salvador, from Guatemala, from Honduras, what is traditionally called the Northern Triangle of Central America. A lot of these individuals are fleeing their countries to get away from incredible gang violence, as well as poverty, climate change, other issues that are impacting their daily lives. And yes, they do see a lot of economic opportunity in the United States, but what is driving a lot of them to leave is just fear of what they're facing in their own countries. And so many of these individuals may also qualify for some of the relief that we're going to talk about in a little bit. But particularly in the DC area, we see huge concentrations of these particular communities. So refugees versus asylees. So in the last slide, I was talking about refugees pretty broadly as people who generally are fleeing war or persecution in some form and are moving around the world. But these terms actually do have specific definitions. And so when you hear them, it's good for you to understand what they really mean. So refugees and asylees in immigration law are two different things. And they're both paths to safety. They're both paths that were created so that individuals could find stability. So refugees, the easiest way to think about it, are people who are not yet in the United States. They are abroad. They're living elsewhere. They could be in their home country, or more likely, it could be that they are in a country that is very close to their home country. And so what happens is a lot of refugees flee out of their home country. They go to a neighboring country. During the Vietnam War, many Vietnamese refugees fled to Thailand and other parts of Southeast Asia. And really, once they got there, and during that time, we set up the process of creating refugee camps. And so they are both camps in the traditional sense that they are, places where people live, usually in kind of camp-like settings. Sometimes they're in, tents or cabins or just living outside. But they're also processing camps. And so they are places where refugees can meet with individuals from the UN and other NGOs and non-government organizations. And they process these individuals there to determine whether or not they meet the definition of refugee, which I'll go to in a moment. But they're the ones who, the UN agencies are the ones who are able to basically start people on the path of becoming refugees who can leave and settle somewhere else. And so they can choose what country they get settled in, or the UN can find a country for them. And then they're processed and they go out of the country and they go resettle in a new country. And so a lot of the families that you're working with went through this refugee process. They might have gone through some variation of it. In certain times of war, we don't do this refugee process in a neighboring country. And so some Afghans I know were airlifted out of Kabul. They were brought directly to a neighboring country and then brought to the United States. They didn't necessarily have to go through this processing. Refugees are limited in the United States. And so we set a cap every year. And so I'm sure you've heard about this in the news. That cap fluctuates, depends on politics and policies. So we were at about a high of about 85,000 refugees settled in the United States in 2016. And we hit an all-time low, well, a low since we started at about 11,000 in 2020. So that is a huge drop in refugee numbers. And that number, thankfully, is starting to increase again. The caps are going back up, but it is still quite a very small number. When you think about the last slide, the millions that I was talking about, if we're taking in 85,000, that is really just a drop in the bucket. So asylees are here in the United States. So that is the main difference. Asylum seekers come to the United States in a variety of ways. Some of them come across the borders. They flee through the US-Mexico border predominantly. And so sometimes they present themselves at the border, sometimes not. They make it through. Some asylum seekers come here on a variety of visas. They could come here as students. They could come here as employees. They could come here as tourists. But then once they get here, they realize that they can't go back, or they already knew that they couldn't go back. And then they apply for asylum in the United States. And so they apply through what is called the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS. You'll probably see that acronym a lot when you're working with your families. Or they can apply in immigration court. So most of your families probably won't be in immigration court. Immigration court is reserved for those who violate some form of immigration law and are essentially being prosecuted in the United States for an immigration violation. So most asylum seekers that you'll be working with came in through some sort of legal way. And then they decided to apply. But for those who came in and were either apprehended or detained, they would be in immigration court. There are no caps to asylum because it is a matter of international law. And so we as a country have kind of acceded to these international treaties and say that, you know, we don't turn away people who make it to our borders or who make it into our country. And who cannot go back to their home countries because of persecution. And so these principles of international law, they define what is a refugee, who is a refugee, and who can apply for asylum, who is eligible for asylum. The definition is a little bit complex. I put it here. I'm going to go through it with you, but you can read it for yourself. It has a lot of different components. So I'll just break it down a little bit. So the first section, unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin. So it's someone who really cannot go back to the country that they were born in, and that they are a citizen of. So there are some individuals who go to another country and then come to the United States. It's always questionable whether those individuals can file for asylum in the United States. There is some law that says that they need to apply for asylum where they stop first. And that doesn't mean, you know, they're on a layover for a few hours or something like that. But if they are in a country for, you know, a significant period of time and they're living there and they've established life there, if they have the opportunity to apply for asylum, then our law basically says that they should have applied there. So they have to have a well-founded fear of being persecuted, or I'll just stop there, being persecuted, a well-founded fear. And so they do need to establish this fear of return. And, you know, that seems pretty obvious. I mean, I think it's, you know, anyone can say they're afraid of going back. That fear also has to be a reasonable one. And so, you know, it has to be something that a group of individuals in a similar situation would find fearful of returning. And that fear has to be of persecution. So persecution in the legal terms has a lot of definitions, but it's kind of what you think of on the pure definitions of persecution. It is, physical violence, it's torture, it could be attempted murder, kidnapping, sexual abuse, all of that. But it's also more than that too. It could be threats of any of those things. It could be even implied threats of those things. So somebody thinks that you are X and they persecute you because of that. And so it could be many, many things. So it's good to think about persecution, not just in the traditional way, but a little bit more broadly. And then the biggest kind of area of this definition is the last part. So the reason that they're being persecuted has to be because of these enumerated grounds: race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. So that is to say, your persecution, the reason you're being beat up or assaulted, cannot just be because someone is crime is bad, or there's just general violence. It has to be, and even war, that in and of itself is not enough. It has to be because you as an individual are being persecuted because of your race, your religion, etc. So most of those are pretty easy to figure out. Your race, you're targeted because of the color of your skin or your ethnic group. Your religion, again, pretty obvious. It could be your actual religion, or your what people think is your religion, or your lack of religion. Your nationality, again, pretty simple. If you're within a country but you're from another country and you're being persecuted because you're a minority, that could be grounds for asylum. And political opinion also is fairly straightforward. If you have certain political beliefs, whether you support one political party or another. But political opinion can go beyond just political party. It can also be your thoughts on certain issues. So for example, we've had success on women who've had certain beliefs on women's rights within their country. I know an issue that comes up in Afghanistan. And so that could be another grounds for political opinion. In Ukraine now, there will be a lot of issues of political opinion that are coming up as governments shift there. The one that is most complicated is that fourth one, the membership of a political social group. That one is a little vague. It's hard to understand just from hearing it. But it basically says that you are a part of some group that is not any of those other things: race, religion, nationality, political opinion. And because of your membership in that group, and it's something that you cannot or should not have to change about yourself, and that causes people to persecute you or something along those lines. And so I think one of the easiest ones to think about is sexual orientation. So it's not really listed under any of those other categories, but we have many asylum claims based on this membership in a particular social group. So you are a homosexual man living in a country where homosexuality is illegal, and you could be abused for it, and the government is doing nothing to protect you, then that could be grounds for asylum. That last piece I just mentioned, that the government is either causing the persecution itself. So we know now the Taliban in Afghanistan, or if a Russian regime takes over in Ukraine, the government itself could be persecuting individuals. But it could also be that the government is basically turning a blind eye to others who are persecuting individuals. So they know that there is violence going on between certain ethnic groups or whatnot, and they're doing nothing to protect the minority group. That could also be grounds for asylum or refugee status. So these are the same, this is the same definition for both. It just depends on where you are when you apply for these things. I'll pause there. That was a lot. And I'm just going to run through the chat. So, okay, so it looks like there's some questions on the last. Oh, good. Okay, so I'm learning more about the families that you work with. So it's good to know that there are many from Latin America and other parts of the world. So somebody asked a question about the victims of domestic violence, where the state is not protecting you. So that would fall in under that particular social group category. We've had success representing primarily women, although not always women, who have fled domestic violence situations. That area of law came under attack in the last administration, and it was really in flux. It is starting to come back a little bit through case law, and so through cases that are successful in the courts. But it's not a settled area for sure. There is still a lot of uncertainty there. So we have a lot of those cases. We do our best to craft that definition of a social group as narrowly as possible, so that a judge doesn't have to make a decision that this is all women everywhere who face domestic violence, but that our clients are facing a particular type of danger connected to them being a victim of domestic violence. Similarly with the gang claims as well, somebody asked a question about that. That is also a very tough area of asylum law. And as you can imagine, there is a lot of resistance into opening up asylum law as broadly as possible. That just means more immigrants come to the country. My personal opinion, I think if they qualify, then they should come, whether it's numbers or not. But as you can imagine, there's a lot of political balancing to do there. So the gang violence is a particular area that is a challenge. We have been successful in those claims as well, again, through that particular social group category. But you have to kind of craft it a little more narrowly than just saying, oh, it's a victim of a gang. We've created arguments about adolescent men who are targeted by gangs because of their poverty connected to a certain family or something like that. We've also seen young women who are recruited into gangs to basically serve as sexual slaves for gang members. And so we've had success on those types of asylum claims as well. How much do you need to prove in one of these cases for asylum? Right, so the 10% statistic to prove has always been floated around. There's nowhere really in law that affirmatively says that you have to just have a 10%. And I don't even know what you'd say is a 10% proof. But it's the level of proof in asylum these days is fairly high. So you have to provide a lot of corroborating evidence. We usually submit a declaration from our clients that really outlines their story very carefully. If we can get declarations from other witnesses or people, even if they're in their home country, we try to do that. And so we try to provide as much supporting evidence as possible. And I won't be going into the details of how you actually go through the asylum process, but the gist of it is for the most of your clients, they will be going to an asylum office where they'll be having an interview from an asylum officer. And that asylum officer will ask a lot of questions of your families. And so they need to be able to share their story very credibly, very honestly, and in detail. And so we prepare all of our clients for these interviews. We practice with them, and we can accompany them as well as attorneys. They allow one attorney to go accompany the clients, so we're there with them to make sure everything goes okay. I will not be addressing Title 42 in this presentation. It's a little bit outside the scope of this, but maybe we can chat about that at some other time. All right, so I'm going to pause there. I know there are a lot of other questions coming in, and we'll just keep going through, and then if others have questions at the end, we can address some of those. All right, so let me just move on to the next slide here. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention, which is relevant to this conversation, is that asylum seekers have to apply for asylum within 1 year of entering the United States. And so it seems kind of arbitrary, but basically the government is saying that if you have a well-founded fear of returning to your home country, you need to hurry up and tell us about it. And so a lot of clients, have this, they come to the United States, they're facing incredible trauma. They're trying to get their lives together, get a job, get their kids in school. They don't really think about, filing an immigration application, but they need to do that. And so the more you can kind of encourage families to at least think about it and connect with services, the better. This 1 year deadline is not a hard and fast deadline. There are ways around it, but it makes their cases much, much harder if they don't apply within 1 year. All right, so the benefits of refugee status and asylum status. So why are we getting this? I mean, it's part of it is obvious. You don't have to go back to your home country. You don't face the fear of deportation. And that of course brings an incredible amount of stability and comfort to our families. But beyond that, it actually gives them a whole host of other benefits. And these are things that you can think about with your families as well, as to what will create the most stability for them. So the ultimate goal for any immigrant coming into the United States is to get a green card. You've probably heard of them. They're actually no longer green, but they are very beneficial. And so that is what the technical term is, becoming a legal permanent resident. And so that means that you can remain in the United States permanently. You still have to renew your status every 10 years, but generally speaking, once you get your permanent status, it's really hard to lose it. There are ways to lose it, but unless you do something really stupid or dangerous, it's pretty hard to lose it. And that status leads to a whole host of other benefits as well. And so refugees must apply for a green card after they're here. They have 1 year to do that. Asylees have the option of applying for green card status. They don't necessarily have to apply, but after 1 year, they are eligible to apply for a green card. With your asylum status or your refugee status, you get an employment authorization document, EAD. These are fantastic little cards that allow people to work in the United States. And so I'm sure you're hearing this from a lot of your families, that the number one priority that they want is to be able to work so that they can earn incomes, that they can provide for their families and also cover rent and food and all the things that are so expensive right now. So this EAD is usually time limited, so it's not forever, usually about 1 or 2 years on that card, and you have to renew it. There's also a cost for this as well as the green card. There is a fee, and so you should probably think about how the families are going to pay for these fees. There are fee waivers available for some of these documents. So if your clients are still very low income, they may be eligible for a fee waiver, but they should look into the requirements for qualifying for a fee waiver. It is not easy to get. These fees can run, I think the green card fee right now is over $1,000 per person. And so if it's a family of 4, that's a whole lot of money. The work permit, I think, is around $400 right now. So just be cognizant of those expenses. When you get asylum or refugee status, then you can also get a Social Security card. Usually it will have some sort of language on it that says, like, by authorization of DHS, the Department of Homeland Security. That's kind of a caveat on the card. So it's not a full Social Security card, but it is enough to get them at least some benefits through the Social Security system. And it allows them to apply for things like a driver's license and other benefits. The refugee and asylum status also comes with some government provided benefits that are available to individuals. And so if they are looking for housing assistance, if they're looking for a job, a placement, sometimes even like cash benefits, things to help people get on their feet, there are government provided programs that might help your families. One question that we often get from folks who fled their countries is, can I travel outside of the United States? So that could mean traveling to Mexico or Canada or somewhere nearby, but it could also mean that they want to travel back to their home countries. It seems a little bit counterintuitive why somebody who fled their country would now want to go back to their countries, but as you can imagine, people have families and they want to see loved ones and their homeland, and so they might ask you, like, I wonder if I can go back ever. Generally with asylum, I encourage clients not to travel until they either have their green card or even more preferably become US citizens. There is always the fear that the US government could say, well, your claim of asylum was fraudulent because you're no longer afraid of your home country and that you don't fear that persecution that got you the asylum in the first place. However, there are ways that you can get a travel document to help someone who needs to travel. If it's a situation of an emergency, there's a dying family member, something like that, then there are ways you can apply for a special document to allow them to either travel to another country or back to their home country. I don't recommend it though. And then, as I mentioned, once you get your green card and permanent resident status, after 5 years, you are eligible to apply for US citizenship. So this is naturalization. You don't have to, and you can remain being a legal permanent resident in perpetuity as long as you just keep renewing your green card. And you will always, if you choose that path, you will remain a citizen of your home country. But if you choose to become naturalized, then you can, go through that process. You have to apply. There's another fee. You have to take a test to prove your knowledge of English as well as US civics. And then you have to wait for a naturalization date to be sworn in. So that's kind of the end point of the immigration cycle. I'll take a minute here just to talk about some other remedies that are available for immigrants. Some of these might impact your clients, your families, some may not, but it's just probably good to hear about them so that when you hear them pop up, you understand what they mean. So the biggest one right now that is impacting a lot of Afghan and Ukrainian families is temporary protected status. So this is a status that is created to help immigrant communities who are facing disasters or war just as a temporary measure to help those who are kind of displaced by the process. And so the way it usually happens is that there is some sort of disaster or war that pops up. So in the Ukrainian example, the war that happened is happening now. The US government sets a date, and anyone who's in the United States before that date from that country can apply for this temporary protected status as long as they meet certain basic eligibility. And really, this is kind of the lowest amount of protection, but it does give them some protection from being deported. As the name implies, it is temporary, and so it is not a path to a green card. It does not end in legal permanent resident status. And in theory, eventually, this temporary protected status could end for that country. So that the US government could say, okay, no more TPS for Ukraine. Anybody with TPS now has to return to your home country. So this is really a stopgap measure. If you have individuals who qualify, then I encourage them to apply, but they should not just stop there. If they want to remain in the United States, then they should seek other forms of relief. I will just point out that the list of countries that qualify for temporary protected status is beyond just Ukraine and Afghanistan. There are a lot of countries that are on that list. Countries like Honduras and El Salvador are both on that list. They were set up in the late 90s, early 2000s, and their windows have closed, but anybody who has temporary protected status can remain in the United States until the United States ends it. And they still have not. So that was over 20 years ago, but we still see individuals who have temporary protected status from El Salvador and Honduras, many in the DC area. And so they just keep renewing their TPS, their work permits every few years. And this came under attack in the last administration. There was fear that they were going to overturn TPS for El Salvador, and I believe Honduras as well. But thankfully it wasn't. It's a tough call because they were meant to be protected. They were meant to be temporary. They were supposed to go back. At the same time, it's gone on so long now that there are families, there are people who've been here for decades. They've had US citizen children, where if parents had to leave, the children would be stuck. And so there needs to be a political fix on this one. There are people who remain in the United States that it's not feasible for them to return. So that's kind of an open-ended question right now. The special immigrant visa, you might see this in conjunction with Afghan refugees. We also saw it a lot with Iraqi refugees. This special immigrant visa was created for individuals who helped the United States during times of conflict. So these is primarily reserved for people like interpreters or consultants or people who are kind of embedded with either the US military or a US contractor. Now they are targets. So if they remain in their countries, they are seen as potentially as traitors. And so the United States created this visa as a way for kind of to be thankful, but also to help protect those people who did so much for us during military conflict. Those people are generally get processed within their home countries or nearby country and then come to the United States. This next category, I'll just go through very quickly: U visa, T visa, and VAWA. Those are for victims of serious crimes, human trafficking, or domestic violence in the United States. So you may come across people who've been in the US for a little bit and then sadly either fall as victims of crime here or victims of human trafficking, and that's why they're brought here, or they are the victim of domestic violence from a US citizen or a permanent resident. These are, tragedies when they happen, especially to people who've already been fleeing persecution, but sadly they do happen quite frequently. And if they do, they could be eligible for a type of relief, which would allow them to eventually apply for a green card as well. These were set up by the government to encourage people to come forward and report these incidents. They're basically a law enforcement tool. Special immigrant juvenile status is for children, unaccompanied minors. They basically are for children who were abused, abandoned, or neglected by one or both of their parents. And so it's similar to asylum, basically saying that if you are a child who's faced abuse, we're not going to send you back to an abusive home in your home country if there's no one else to take care of you. And so they can apply for this special immigrant juvenile status. I'll mention humanitarian parole here. This might be how a lot of your clients got to the US. This is not a form of relief in and of itself. It's kind of similar to temporary protected status, but it basically allows people to get out of their countries and come to the United States. So if you see the parole term, basically allows them to come in, get past immigration, whether it's like at the airport or at the border. But then once they get paroled into the United States, they have to apply for something else. They can't just stay in that parole status. So they have to either shift to a different status or apply for that permanent green card I talked about earlier. And then there are other ways that people can migrate here, and you're probably familiar with a lot of these. They have a family member, they're getting married, they have a job that's supporting them, they're coming as a foreign exchange student, they're coming as a tourist. These are technically, yes, they are ways for people to get here, but a lot of the people that we work with, these are not options to them. They don't have family here. They're not either eligible or they don't have the skills to apply for jobs that will support you. They don't have the funds to become a foreign exchange student, and they can't be tourists. They don't have the luxury of being tourists. So while you might see some people come here through these ways, they are generally not common for the folks that we work with. However, if you do see folks under these categories, they still can apply for asylum, as I mentioned before. And even while they're in one of these legitimate statuses and they're still here valid, they can still apply for asylum. And if it's within that 1 year, they definitely should. All right, so my last slide is just about resources. I just listed here some organizations that I work closely with and that my law firm works closely with. Ayuda is a kind of general immigration resource center. They are both in DC, Maryland, and Northern Virginia. And they have an intake line. You can call them if you want to get your family kind of connected with a consultation. A lot of these organizations have intake procedures. The Capital Area Immigrant Rights Coalition, CARE Coalition, also does great work. They focus predominantly on detained immigrants and unaccompanied minors, but they are also doing work now with refugee populations. Catholic Charities, DC, I used to intern with them, great organization. They have a big immigration practice there as well. You don't have to be Catholic to be a client of that organization. Human Rights First focuses a lot on political asylum, and they are also very active right now in the Afghan and Ukrainian refugee crises. My former organization, Kids in Need of Defense, if you come across an unaccompanied child or a child who's living with one parent in the United States that reunified with them, that could be a good resource. There is an organization called Lawyers for Good Government, L4GG. They set up a temporary protected status program right now that's focusing on Ukraine. They are basically taking intake of any Ukrainians here who are in the United States who want to apply for this TPS status. They're going to expand that eventually to Afghanistan TPS and other countries TPS too. So if people are looking for help there, that's a good place to try. The Tahrir Justice Center is an organization that focuses on primarily women and girls who are fleeing persecution based on gender-based violence. So these are all great organizations. They have wonderful staff attorneys that do really hard work on the front lines. These attorneys don't make enough money. They should be getting paid a lot more for what they're doing. So I will just put a plug in that if you're looking for places to donate and give your charitable offerings, then these are fantastic organizations. They do really great work. They are also very overwhelmed, especially right now. And so a lot of these organizations, if you try to call in for an intake for a client, you might get a busy signal. You might get, I'm sorry, we're closed for intake right now. So my best advice there is to just try again and try many different places. Put your eggs in lots of baskets and see what comes up first. It is really hard to find a pro bono lawyer in the immigration space right now. And many people go through this immigration system without a lawyer alone. And there is a huge justice gap. So do what you can and have some grace for these folks who are working very hard. And then at the end, I will also mention the DC Bar Pro Bono Center provides an immigration advice clinic. So not a full representation pro bono match, but if your folks have just some basic immigration questions, some things that don't require necessarily someone representing them, they can go in and just get some brief immigration advice. These, I think, are held quarterly. Almost all of these organizations right now are working remotely, and so their intake procedures are mostly through the telephone or online, and they might do some Zoom clinics here and there. But eventually they will come back and they'll have in-person screenings as well. As you can imagine, it's not ideal to do a intake of someone who's been through trauma and persecution over Zoom, but it is the reality we're living in right now. And then I'll also mention, because this is what I do for a living, that a lot of private law firms are doing good pro bono work in this area. We partner with all of these organizations to accept cases, and we do our best to work to win immigration relief for the clients that we are paired up with. We get trained through these organizations. Not every law firm has an immigration specialist, so our lawyers get trained by these organizations on the slide, and we try to help close that justice gap just a little bit. And then, of course, there are also private immigration law firms out there where they charge a fee. And so if your families have some resources or they've been working for a while and they can afford it, then they might want to seek out a private immigration law firm. And there are, if you Google, there's tons of them. It's a little bit overwhelming to see how many immigration law firms are out there. There are some bar referral services in the DC area that you can check out to kind of get ratings on immigration lawyers. One word of caution, there's a lot of fraud in immigration law right now, and there are unfortunately some unscrupulous lawyers, but predominantly unscrupulous notaries, notarios, and these folks are preying on immigrant families who really just are in desperate need for help, and so they take their money, they charge exorbitant fees, they often don't do what they need to do, or worse, they cause harm that really leads to jeopardy for these clients. And so just be cautious when your firms are seeking private law firms. Just make sure that these are legitimate firms and that they are doing what they say they should be doing. So I will end there. Didn't leave quite enough time for Q&A, but I see that there's a lot of questions in the chat, so I'll try to run through those quickly, and then we'll just go through any other questions folks might have on screen. And some of these, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. Oh, sorry, I thought I heard something. Okay. So I'm going to start with, the delays in immigration cases. Oh, sorry. So one thing, just the affirmative asylum process, most of your clients will go through the asylum office process. That is the asylum officer. If they are in a detained setting, or if they were caught by immigration, then they would go before the immigration judge. If they're going before an immigration judge, I highly recommend they find a lawyer. That is much more adversarial, and they face a prosecutor from ICE. Someone had asked a question about the delays in handling immigration process right now. There are huge delays in the immigration system and the asylum process as well. The one exception to that is the Afghan families, and most likely we'll see this for Ukrainian families soon too. They are under an expedited processing, so we're seeing those cases fly through. We actually had an interview scheduled in 30 days, which is unheard of in immigration. A lot of these cases can take years. And so that's both good and bad. It's good in the sense that if you're waiting for your asylum case, then you're not getting deported. So the more you wait, the less you're getting deported. So you can just ride it out as long as you can. And if your case isn't that weak, then if your case is a little weak, then maybe it's a good thing to wait. But of course, it does leave a lot of uncertainty for clients, and they don't have that stability. And they still need to renew their work permits and all of that. All right, so the lottery system is still in place. It is an extremely small number of, it's like 0.0001% of immigrants. So not really a realistic way of trying to come to the United States, but I went through some of the other ways that you can get in. That first in, first out, last in, first out process is no longer a way of processing asylum claims, but it's still confusing as to what to do with the people who were processed under that in the last administration. So basically, if you applied, you were put to the front of the pile, which pushed back everybody else and made their waits much, much longer. So we're still seeing some shifting of that prioritization of asylum clients, but we're not hoping that we will go back to the old system where it just go, you deal with the oldest cases first. So can someone go to the US embassy in the country and ask for refugee status? No, you have to be going through a refugee camp in that situation. And so sometimes the US embassy can direct people to refugee camps, but they themselves cannot do refugee processing. What kind of processing is done in processing centers at refugee camps? I don't really know this. This is not an area I do that much work in because I'm here. But I suspect that they do some of the screening for health, as making sure that people have their vaccines and whatnot, that they're eligible to travel. They have to meet certain eligibility requirements. They also do the screening that I mentioned about their fear of returning. They do an interview with them that's sort of similar to an asylum interview. There is an appeal process. So if you lose at the immigration office stage, you actually then go to immigration court. So it's what I was talking about before, the immigration court system. You get a second chance, you get a second bite at the apple. But as I said, it's a little more adversarial. There's a prosecutor and a judge. So you really do want to win at the asylum office phase. It's a much more immigrant friendly, if it can be called so, process. Great. So yes, Just Neighbors, excellent organization. And the legitimacy of a law firm, it's tough. That the reason that they succeed in this fraud is because they're good at doing it. So I always try to, check bar licenses. I make sure that people are registered. You can look at the state bar and look up attorneys. You can look at ratings. If it is a referral service from a state bar or like the Fairfax County Bar has a referral service, I usually have a little bit more trust in them so that they've done some vetting there. But still, unfortunately, some people slip through and they, take advantage. So just be cautious. Any questions from the group here that people want to just unmute and ask? We have a couple of minutes.
Hi, Paul. This has been super helpful. Really appreciate it. what we've seen we have 19 families now, and what we've seen in most cases is they haven't gone through anything. I mean, maybe credible fear, but that's it. And then they get put into the asylum court system, and it's about a 4-year wait, more or less. Are we missing something in that?
You're right. And so it's good that they have applied for asylum. I will encourage them, even if they're not their case is not completely ready, they should at least get their asylum application in so that they preserve that 1-year deadline. It also allows them to get that work permit a little bit faster so that once the asylum application is in, they can apply for the work permits 6 months later. But yeah, that wait is there. So during that time, you need to try to find lawyers for them, or they can, encourage them to look at those resources that I said, because it does take a lot of time to prepare for your case. And 4 years is a lot of time, but it can move by, and especially when it gets farther away and things change in the governments, you want to make sure that the lawyer is kind of up to date on what's happening and making sure that they understand the country conditions as well. So lots to prepare. You can never be early enough. So start now, and if it's too much time, that's a good thing. That's rarely ever a problem.
Well, and that's what my kind of follow-up question was, which I know someone had asked, but generally, how do we vet firms? And what we've had actually a couple of problems with some very super well-known DC firms who were doing pro bono work, but really didn't have experience with immigration.
Yeah.
And so it delayed the process by a year, and the person couldn't work, and it costs more for us when we're helping financially support people. So do you have any guides for us on how to kind of vet
Sure.
both pro bono as well as, I mean, the nonprofit groups you listed are phenomenal, but they're overloaded. So if we, it's for them and the immigration firms.
So if a law firm is working pro bono, I would highly recommend that they are connected through those organizations. So we rarely take on pro bono work that what I consider like a cold call or a community call. If you were to call me and say, I have a family that needs a lawyer, I would say, okay, let's check with one of those organizations first and work together. I would have them vet the case, and they can screen the case. They're the experts. And then they would connect with one of our lawyers who's been trained and who is mentored throughout the process. So that attorney, even though may not have immigration experience, would not be taking on this case by themselves. I would never put someone with 0 immigration experience to take on an immigration matter by themselves. That is just recipe for malpractice. So if they're paired up with a legal services provider, then I'm more comfortable with it. If it's someone who says, I'm going to try it out by myself and see how it goes, that's a red flag. With the immigration firms, you would suspect that they would know what they're doing, but again, just be mindful of fraudulent firms.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry you went through that experience. If it was a firm that I can help talk to someone there, I'd be happy to.
I think it was a
situation.
misunderstanding over what they could do. You know what I mean?
Okay.
Because, like, as you know, the immigration law is changing all the time, and also with, as you know, for pro bono, everyone's super busy. It goes to the bottom of their pile. So it's more things, very understandable things. Certainly no malintent, but we kind of
Jean's more forgiving than I am. They're on my naughty list. So yeah. Hope go ahead.
I'm sorry, I can stay on a couple more minutes. I just saw another hand raised.
Okay, great.
I got that question.
Margie.
I think you're on mute, Margie.
I apologize. During the pandemic, when the courts were closed, what happened then to the cases that are, for example, if a date is in November of 2023, and what happened? Does everything move forward, or is there some general?
Yeah, all the it's not just the court, but the asylum office itself. Everything that was during the pandemic was predominantly canceled for a long time. Now they're coming back. Actually, they were coming back in person. There was some virtual, but they weren't that great. The technology wasn't great. So those hearings were moved years out, but they didn't push back everything else. So if it's scheduled for November 2023, you assume it's going to be November 2023 unless you hear otherwise. So they're not pushing everything back. They just push those particular hearings to the back of the pile. Everything else goes on as scheduled.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. Any last questions?
Just a quick question on humanitarian parolees. So they can apply directly for a green card without applying for asylum. Is that true?
Generally, yes. Yeah, most parole, they come in with instructions that say, you know, kind of eligible to come in and apply for a green card. They have to do it within the period of their parole. And that parole can be very short sometimes. So they need to make sure that they get that green card application in during that window.
And is that the case? I know that's not the case with the Ukrainians. They do not.
Unclear right now.
Okay.
That situation is still in flux. So we'll know more, I think, in a few months whether the U.S. government will set up a similar program like they did for Afghanistan. It's different. It's a different situation in Ukraine than it is in Afghanistan. So we'll see how that plays out.
All right, thank you. Oh, all right, David, you're the last one, David.
Question about the U visa.
Mhm.
If an individual is granted a U visa, what's the next step? What does that entitle that person to do next?
Yeah, so the U visa and the T visa, the victims of crime or victims of trafficking, they, similar to asylum, they have to wait a certain period of time, and then they have to wait 3 years instead of the 1 year. And then after the 3 years is up, they can also apply for a green card. So I like to think of it as like a silver lining. It's something really terrible happened to this person in the US. We actually had an Afghan refugee family who was living in a hotel in Virginia. Their son got assaulted in Virginia by Virginia residents. So can you imagine coming to the United States, fleeing a war-torn country, and then being beaten up in the United States? But terrible situation. The son reported the crime. Law enforcement investigated it, and sort of in return for that bravery of coming forward, that we were able to apply for a U visa. So that family probably would have been eligible for other relief as well, but we just decided to go that route.
All right, Paul, we'll welcome you back because I think that you can tell we have a lot of questions as we continue on this journey, but hopefully you won't hide from us now that we do have a lot of questions and 19 families. So thank you so much.
Like I said, do reach out to those resources because they are the true experts. I just play an immigration lawyer on TV, but they are excellent, and yeah, take advantage of them.
Thanks so much, Paul. It was terrific. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Take care.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Oh, thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Yeah, great.